On a cold night in New York City, inside the Golden Fork, a luxurious Fifth Avenue restaurant, Robert Langley sat alone. He had it all: money, power, respect, but none of it made him happy. As laughter filled the air and crystal glasses sparkled, he felt empty. His phone buzzed, but he ignored it. Nothing mattered tonight, or so he thought. Then the door flew open. Heads turned as a young girl ran inside. She wore a bright red hoodie that looked too big for her small frame. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Robert. Without hesitation, she rushed toward him. "My mom needs help now." Robert felt his chest tighten. He wasn't used to being interrupted, let alone by someone so out of place. The restaurant buzzed around them, but for Robert, everything else faded. It was just him and this child with wide, pleading eyes. For a moment, he thought about saying no. After all, what could he do? He wasn't a doctor or a hero. He was just a man trying to eat dinner. But then he saw it, the desperation in her face. It reminded him of his sister, Emily, who had died years ago after battling illness. She'd been young, too. Without another thought, Robert stood up. "Take me to her," he said firmly. The girl blinked, surprised he'd agreed. Then she nodded quickly and turned toward the door. Robert grabbed his coat and followed her outside. The contrast hit him immediately. 1 minute, he was surrounded by luxury. The next, he was walking through cold city streets lined with flickering streetlights. They stopped at a small building that looked like it might crumble any day. Inside, the hallway smelled damp, and the walls were cracked. "This way," Jasmine whispered, leading him upstairs. At the end of the hall, she pushed open a door. What Robert saw next made his stomach drop. A woman lay on the floor, pale and still. Her breathing was shallow, almost non-existent. "She collapsed," Jasmine said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I didn't know what to do." Robert didn't waste time. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. As he waited for the ambulance, he knelt beside the woman, holding her hand. For the first time in years, he felt something real, something bigger than himself. The ambulance arrived quickly, its sirens cutting through the quiet night. Paramedics rushed in, lifting Tanya onto a stretcher. Jasmine clung to Robert's arm, her tiny hands shaking. "Will she be okay?" she asked, her voice breaking. Robert didn't have an answer. All he could do was nod and promise, "I'll stay with you." At the hospital, doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize Tanya. Robert stayed by Jasmine's side, watching as she paced back and forth, wiping tears from her face. He wanted to comfort her, but didn't know how. Instead, he quietly covered the medical bills, no questions asked. When Tanya finally woke up hours later, weak but alive, Jasmine cried with relief. "Thank you," she whispered to Robert, her voice full of gratitude. "You didn't have to do this." But deep down, Robert knew he did have to. Something inside him had shifted that night. For years, he'd lived behind walls of wealth and privilege, disconnected from the struggles of others. Now those walls were cracking. Over the next few weeks, Robert found himself visiting Tanya and Jasmine often. Their tiny apartment was humble, a far cry from his penthouse, but it felt warm in a way his home never did. Tanya shared stories about working 2 jobs to keep food on the table and dreams of giving Jasmine a better future. "You're stronger than most people I know," Robert told her one day. Tanya smiled faintly. "Strength doesn't mean not falling. It means getting back up every time you do." Her words stuck with him long after he left. Back in his empty penthouse, Robert stared out at the city skyline. For the first time in years, he felt restless. Not because of what he lacked, but because of what he could give. Something inside Robert had changed. He couldn't stop thinking about Tanya and Jasmine. Their struggles, their strength, their hope despite everything. It made him see the world differently. For years, he'd focused only on himself, building wealth but forgetting why it mattered. Now, he wanted to use his money for something bigger than himself. One evening, as he sat in his office overlooking the city, an idea came to him. What if he could help kids like Jasmine? Kids who dreamed big but didn't have the tools to make those dreams come true. That night, he started making calls. By morning, He'd set up a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. Word spread quickly. Soon, letters poured in from families thanking him for giving their children a chance. One letter stood out. A boy named Marcus wrote about how the scholarship allowed him to attend college and study engineering. "You saved my future," Marcus said. Inspired, Robert went further. He invested in affordable housing projects, creating safe homes for families struggling to get by. People began calling him a hero, but Robert didn't care about the praise. What mattered was the difference he was making. Meanwhile, Tanya regained her strength and started a small catering business with Robert's support. Her food became popular in the neighborhood, bringing in enough money to finally breathe easier. Jasmine thrived in school, earning top grades and dreaming of becoming a doctor someday. One afternoon, Jasmine looked at Robert and asked, "Why do you keep helping us?" Robert hesitated. Then he said simply, "Because I needed reminding of what really matters." Jasmine smiled. "Well, you remind me that good people still exist." Her words stayed with him long after she left. For the first time in years, Robert felt alive. Not because of what he owned, but because of what he gave. Years passed, and Robert's acts of kindness continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways he never expected. The scholarship fund grew, helping hundreds of students chase their dreams. Affordable housing projects transformed neighborhoods, giving families stability they'd never known before. And Tanya's catering business? It became a local favorite, even catching the attention of a famous chef who offered her a partnership. But the biggest surprise came when Marcus, the boy whose letter had touched Robert years ago, showed up at his office one day. Now a successful engineer, Marcus introduced Robert to influential contacts in industries Robert had long wanted to break into. Together, they launched innovative projects that revitalized Robert's career and brought him professional success he hadn't felt in decades. Through it all, Jasmine remained a constant presence in Robert's life. She graduated high school at the top of her class, earning a full ride to medical school. On graduation day, she stood on stage to give a speech. "I wouldn't be here today without someone who believed in me and my mom when we had nothing," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "That person showed me that kindness can change everything. So thank you, Mr. Langley, for saving us, and for showing me what it means to truly live." The crowd erupted in applause, and Robert sat there, tears streaming down his face. For so long, he'd thought wealth was the measure of success. But now he knew the truth. Real wealth wasn't about money. It was about connection, purpose, and making a difference. As Jasmine stepped off the stage and hugged him tightly, Robert whispered, "Thank you, Jasmine. You changed my life too." And just like that, two lives, one rich in resources, the other rich in resilience, had transformed each other forever. So, where are you from? And what will your next act of kindness bring? Years later, Robert stood on a sunny park bench overlooking Manhattan. The city had changed, but some things remained the same. The hum of traffic, the chatter of people rushing by, and the endless promise of new beginnings. Beside him sat Jasmine, now Dr. Jasmine Carter, a pediatrician known for her work with underserved communities. She smiled as she watched children play on the swings, their laughter echoing through the air. "You've come a long way," Robert said, his voice warm with pride. "So have you," Jasmine replied, turning to him. "You know, when I first met you, I thought you were just another rich guy who didn't care about anyone but himself." Robert chuckled. "And now I know you're proof that people can change, for the better." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the world move around them. Then Jasmine pulled out her phone and showed him a photo. It was of Tanya, standing proudly in front of her catering business, which had expanded into multiple locations across the city. "She's doing amazing," Jasmine said. "And it's all because of you." Robert shook his head. "No, it's because of her. She's the one who never gave up." Jasmine nodded thoughtfully. "Still, you gave her a chance when no one else would. That's what makes you different." As they talked, a young boy ran up to them, holding a soccer ball. "Dr. Carter, can you help me practice?" he asked eagerly. Jasmine grinned and stood up. "Of course. Be right back," she told Robert before jogging off to join the boy. Watching her go, Robert felt a deep sense of peace. He thought about how far they'd all come since that fateful night at the Golden Fork. A desperate plea from a child had sparked a chain reaction of kindness, resilience, and transformation. He glanced down at his hands, remembering the weight of Tanya's frail hand that night in the hospital. Back then, he'd felt powerless. But now he understood. Even small acts of kindness could set off waves of change. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting golden light over the park, Robert whispered to himself, "Wherever you're from, it doesn't matter. What matters is where you choose to go, and who you choose to help along the way." And with that, he smiled, knowing his journey was far from over.